So how can leases be terminated? Obviously, you see several ways right here, so we're going to touch on them real quick. But probably the most common way a lease is terminated is just by expiration. Hopefully most leases are in writing. There will be an expiration date at some point, and again, that's the most common and certainly the most preferred way to terminate a lease. But another way would be just by surrender and acceptance. Obviously, that's a mutual agreement between the property owner and the tenant. Say the tenant signs a 1-year lease, and 3 or 4 months into the lease, the property owner would like to do something else with the property, and they can't do it with the tenant there. So obviously, could the property owner or manager, could they ask the tenant to terminate the lease and leave? Obviously, they can ask anything. But if that tenant says, no, I'm not leaving, then you're stuck with them. You're under contract and they're allowed to stay. However, maybe they would be willing to leave. Now, it may require some additional compensation. Maybe you could pay them some amount of money to agree to terminate the lease and leave. But at the end of the day, as long as both parties agree to terminate the lease, that's just considered a surrender and an acceptance. It's all good. It could be terminated just by operation of law. That maybe something about the law requires the lease to be terminated. I will tell you a couple of those examples are right here. Condemnation, which is dealing with eminent domain. If the state feels like they need that property worse than the tenant and the property owner, they're going to take the property, and that will terminate the lease. Foreclosure, that terminates the lease. All of those are components or elements of operation of law. At the end of the day, the law is typically going to win out on that issue. Breach of contract by either party would terminate the lease. If the tenant's not complying with the lease, or if the landlord is not complying with their requirements in the lease. That would be grounds to terminate the lease by breach. Destruction of the premises. If the tenant is not maintaining the property, they're destroying the property. They're tearing the property up. There's holes all in the wall. Obviously, that's grounds for lease termination, and that tenant will likely be evicted. But these last two, we kind of touched on them already. Condemnation. Remember, condemnation is another term for eminent domain. In fact, on the exam, they could use either term, condemnation or eminent domain, because that's what the state does when they are taking property through eminent domain. They condemn the property and then take the property, for the good of the public. Obviously, they got to pay for it. Just compensation must be paid. But if they do condemn the property to take it via eminent domain, that will terminate the lease. And then the last one you see there is foreclosure. Now, this is kind of sad for the tenant, because oftentimes, the tenant's paying their rent. They're doing what they're supposed to do. But the property owner is not making their house payment or mortgage payment. So the lender has to foreclose on the property. And when and if that happens, that foreclosure will terminate the lease. And unfortunately for the tenant, they're going to have to leave. Just part of the recourse, I guess. But, I will tell you this, if you know a tenant that's dealing with this type of situation where basically the lender has foreclosed on the property and now demanding the tenant to vacate, Y'all, there is this thing called cash for keys, and this is not necessarily testable at all. Just letting you know. Y'all, the tenant could say, I'm not leaving unless you pay me to leave. And I will tell you, typically it's cheaper for the lender to pay them, give them some money in exchange for turning over the keys and moving out. Y'all, they call that cash for keys. So even though there's some pain and suffering, aggravation for the tenant to have to move out, they could require the or demand the lender, give them some money for it. However much they can get, that'll be up to them to negotiate that. But those are some of the ways to terminate the leases. Y'all, hopefully, and the best way again to terminate that lease is just through expiration.